The envelope had been sitting beside her water glass for 40 minutes when Marcus finally noticed it. He leaned over, his voice low and controlled, and asked her what it was. Claire looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a problem she has already solved. Then she smiled. She had been waiting 3 months for this exact moment, and she was not going to rush it. The envelope had been sitting beside her water glass for 40 minutes when Marcus finally noticed it. He leaned over slowly, the way he always did when he wanted to appear casual, about something that had already caught his full attention. His voice dropped just below the ambient noise of the room, the soft clink of crystal, the measured laughter of people who had learned to perform ease in expensive rooms. "What is that?" he asked. Claire Donovan did not look up immediately. She lifted her water glass, took one small sip, and set it back down with the kind of precision that came from years of steadying her hands under pressure. Then she turned to him. Her expression was calm. Not the calm of someone who had nothing to say. The calm of someone who had already decided exactly when she would say it. She smiled. It was the same smile she wore in the operating room when a procedure had gone exactly as planned. Quiet, certain, completely unreadable to anyone who did not know what it meant. "You should enjoy the evening," she said. "They're about to start the program." Marcus studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he straightened in his chair, adjusted the front of his jacket, and turned back toward the room. The Fairmont Copley Plaza was dressed for the occasion. The Hargrove Medical Center annual gala was the kind of event that Boston's medical community circled on their calendars months in advance. Chandeliers cast a warm gold light across the ballroom, catching the edges of crystal glasses and the polished surfaces of award plaques arranged along the far wall. 200 of the city's most respected physicians, administrators, and donors filled the room, their conversations layered into a low, practiced hum. At the center of it all, as he had always been, was Marcus Donovan. He was the kind of man rooms organized themselves around, without anyone quite realizing it was happening. As director of Hargrove Medical Center, one of the most prominent private hospitals in the Northeast, he had spent 15 years cultivating the particular authority that came not from volume, but from stillness. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply needed to be present, and people adjusted. Claire had once found that quality remarkable. She had married it, in fact, on a clear October afternoon 8 years ago, believing that a man who could hold a room without effort was a man who could hold a life together with the same quiet strength. She had been 28 then. She had not yet understood the difference between stillness and concealment. Now she was 36, and she understood it completely. Across the table, a senior administrator from the hospital's board offered Marcus a question about the upcoming expansion project. Marcus answered smoothly, his attention shifting away from Claire, as naturally as a tide pulling back from shore. He was good at that, redirecting, reframing, moving conversation away from anything that required genuine examination. Claire watched him for a moment. Then she turned toward the room. She had chosen table 7 deliberately. It sat close enough to the center of the ballroom to remain visible far enough from the podium to observe without drawing notice. She had thought about the geometry of the evening for weeks, where people would stand, where attention would gather, where a person could act quietly and still be seen by everyone who needed to see it. The envelope rested beside her water glass, plain white, unsealed now that Marcus had touched it, though he had not opened it. Not yet. She had prepared it 2 nights before, sitting alone at the small desk in her home office, while the rest of the house was dark. She had worked slowly, going through each page one final time, before sliding them together in order. The process had felt less like building something and more like finishing it, because the work had been done long before that night. Over 90 days of early mornings and careful questions and details, collected with the patience of someone who understood that the truth did not need to be chased. It only needed to be followed. Marcus laughed at something the administrator said. The sound carried across the table easily, warm and practiced. Claire did not react. She had spent the better part of 8 years reading the space between what Marcus said and what Marcus meant. She had become skilled at it, the way a person becomes skilled at anything they do every day without choosing to. The slight delay before a specific answer. The questions he deflected by answering a different one. The version of himself he assembled each morning before he walked out of the bedroom door. She used to believe that she was the only one who noticed. She knew better now. The program would begin in 20 minutes. The room was still settling, still arranging itself into the configuration of a celebration. People moved between tables. Glasses were refilled. The low hum of conversation shifted and reformed like something living. Marcus had not looked at the envelope again, but she had seen the way his eyes had paused on it. The half-second of recognition that he had not expected to feel. That half-second was enough. Claire picked up her water glass again, not to drink, simply to have something to hold. Outside the tall windows of the ballroom, the first snow of December was falling across Copley Square in long, quiet diagonals. The city moved on the other side of the glass, indifferent and unhurried. She had been waiting for this moment for a very long time, and she was not going to rush it. To understand what brought Claire Donovan to Table 7 of the Fairmont Copley Plaza on a snowy December evening, you have to go back to the house on Chestnut Street. It was the kind of home that made people pause on the sidewalk. A red brick, federal-style townhouse in the heart of Beacon Hill with black shutters, a freshly painted front door, and window boxes that Marcus kept filled with seasonal arrangements because he understood perhaps better than anyone that the outside of a thing determined how people experienced the inside. The neighbors smiled when they passed. Visitors always said the same thing when they stepped through the front door for the first time. They said it was beautiful. Claire had never disagreed with them. She had also never told them that in 8 years of living there, she had not once felt entirely at home. It wasn't a feeling she had arrived at quickly. It had settled over her gradually, the way certain temperatures do not, with a sudden drop, but with a slow shift that you only recognize once you've already been cold for a while. The house was immaculate. Marcus kept it that way, not because he was particular about cleanliness in the ordinary sense, but because order in his world was a form of communication. A well-maintained home said something about the people inside it. It said they were stable, careful, in control. And Marcus Donovan was always in control. He had a way of managing their shared life that was so seamlessly constructed, it rarely felt like management at all. Dinner reservations appeared without discussion. Weekend plans arrived already formed. Decisions that affected both of them were often presented to Claire as conclusions, rather than conversations delivered in the tone of someone sharing good news. He wasn't unkind about it. That was the part that made it difficult to name. He was attentive, generous in the ways that were visible, and completely at ease with the assumption that his version of their life was the correct one. Claire had spent the early years of their marriage telling herself that this was simply how he was wired. Decisive, efficient. A man who ran a hospital with hundreds of employees had to think in systems. She had extended that understanding far longer than it deserved. She was a cardiothoracic surgeon. She had trained for over a decade to read bodies, to find the place where something had quietly gone wrong before the larger system failed. She was good at it, exceptionally good. And she had spent years applying almost none of that skill to her own life. That had been her mistake. Not a single dramatic error, but a long, incremental willingness to look away. Mornings in the Chestnut Street house followed a pattern so consistent it had become almost architectural. Marcus was always up first. By the time Claire came downstairs, coffee was made, the news was on at low volume, and Marcus was already moving through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had pre-solved the day. He would set her vitamins beside her cup without being asked. A small gesture performed daily that she had always received as consideration. He knew which supplements she took. He had learned them early in her first pregnancy, 4 years into their marriage, and had simply continued the habit through everything that followed. Through the loss of that first pregnancy at 11 weeks, through the second 8 months later, through the third which had come and gone in the early weeks of the previous winter, quiet and devastating, in the way that losses become when a person has already learned not to hope too loudly. She had grieved each one in the particular silence of someone who was also expected to keep functioning. She was a surgeon. People needed her to be steady. Marcus had been supportive in the way he was supportive about most things, present, composed, and somehow already looking forward. He did not linger in difficulty. He processed it and moved on, and he seemed to expect, without saying so, that she would do the same. Claire had, because she had not yet understood what she was actually dealing with. It was in the months following the third loss that she first began to notice the small inconsistencies. Not in the house. In Marcus. He had always been private, with his devices. She had attributed that to professional habit, given the sensitivity of the information that passed through a hospital director's communications. But there was a difference she was learning between professional discretion and deliberate concealment. His phone was never left unattended. Notifications were cleared with a regularity that went beyond tidiness. When calls came in during the evening, he took them in another room as a matter of course. None of these things individually meant anything specific. Together, they formed the beginning of a question she had not yet let herself finish asking. It was a Tuesday evening in early October when she first heard the name. Marcus had come home later than expected, which was not unusual, and had moved through the kitchen while describing his afternoon in the clipped, efficient way he used when he was managing how much he said. A new nurse had handled a difficult patient transition well. A scheduling conflict had been resolved, and one of the staff members on the cardiac floor, a charge nurse named Vanessa, had stepped in to manage a coordination issue that would have otherwise fallen to him. He said it the way you say the name of someone whose competence you've noted once and expect to note again. Useful, reliable, unremarkable. Claire had been rinsing a glass at the sink when he mentioned it. She set the glass in the drying rack and turned off the water. That was thoughtful of her, she said. She's good at reading situations, Marcus replied. Knows when to act without being told. Claire nodded. She asked nothing further, and Marcus moved on to something else seamlessly, the way he always did. But she had heard it. The particular quality in his voice when he described someone he respected. The slight ease that entered his tone. The way he had characterized Vanessa, not by her job title or her tenure, but by the quality of her instincts. She filed it away without examining it directly. 3 days later, the name appeared again. A logistical matter, Marcus explained something involving patient discharge, coordination on the floor where she worked. The week after that, it came up in the context of a scheduling decision he had made. Each mention was brief. Each one was framed differently. Each one sounded on its surface like nothing worth noting. That was the third time this week he had mentioned her name without being asked. There are certain rooms that stay with you long after you've left them, not because of what they look like, but because of what you were told inside them. Claire knew this better than most. She had delivered difficult news in rooms like that. Herself had chosen her words carefully, had watched people's faces change in real time, had learned that the kindest thing you could offer in those moments was clarity without cruelty. She had always believed she was good at it. She had not understood, until she was on the receiving end, how little that preparation actually helped. The examination room at her OB's office was on the 4th floor of a medical building in the Back Bay. It was a pleasant space, as those rooms go warm, lighting a small window that looked out over Dartmouth Street, a print of a coastal landscape hanging on the wall across from the table. Someone had put thought into making it feel less clinical. Claire had noticed that detail on her first visit and had appreciated it. By her third time, sitting on that table with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, she had stopped noticing it entirely. The words her doctor used were gentle. They always were. Careful constructions designed to deliver the sharpest kind of information, without unnecessary edges. Claire processed them the way she processed difficult information in her own work, systematically, compartmentally, storing the facts in one place, and the feeling of them somewhere she could access later when she was alone. She had done that 3 times now. The first had come early, before she and Marcus had told anyone. 11 weeks. The loss had been quiet and private and devastating, in the way that first losses are unexpected, without precedent, without the knowledge of how long grief of that particular shape could last. Marcus had held her that night. He had said the right things. He had been in the ways that mattered most in that immediate window present. The second had come 8 months later. By then, she had learned to hold hope at a certain distance, to keep it close enough to function, but far enough to survive its absence. That loss had been harder, not because the grief was greater, but because it arrived with the weight of pattern. 1 was misfortune. 2 began to feel like something else. She had not said that to Marcus. She had not said it to anyone. She had returned to work 11 days later, scrubbed in on a double bypass, and focused on the particular silence of an operating room, which was the only silence she had ever found genuinely useful. The third time she had driven herself to the appointment, Marcus had offered to come. He always offered, but the offer she had begun to notice arrived with the same quality as many of his offers, fully formed, sincerely delivered, and somehow already expecting a particular response. She had told him she would be fine. He had accepted that, with the readiness of someone who had not needed much convincing. She had sat in that room on Dartmouth Street alone, and she had listened, and she had nodded in the right places, and she had driven home in the particular silence of someone who has learned that some things cannot be shared with the person sitting across the dinner table. At home, Marcus had been solicitous. He had made dinner without being asked. He had checked in on her twice before bed, each time, with the measured consideration of someone who had been told what the appropriate response looked like and had executed it well. She had thanked him. She had meant it in the way you mean something that is also insufficient. The next morning, he had brought her supplements to the breakfast table, the same as always. The small amber bottles lined up beside her coffee cup, in the order she usually took them. He set them down without comment, the way he did every morning, as naturally as setting out silverware. She had taken them the same as always, without question, without thought. That was the part that would come back to her. Later in the parking lot of a different medical building, on a gray afternoon in November, with her phone in her hand and her engine running. The part that would reframe everything that had preceded it, with a single, irrevocable shift in meaning. But that was still weeks away. In the days following the third loss, Claire did something she had not done after the first 2. She made an appointment with a private physician, not her regular TOB, not anyone connected to Hargrove Medical Center, but a specialist she had known professionally for years, a reproductive endocrinologist named Dr. Patricia Walsh, who had a quiet, precise manner and a reputation for thoroughness that Claire had always respected. She told Marcus she was seeing someone about her iron levels. He nodded and returned to his phone. The appointment with Dr. Walsh lasted nearly 2 hours. It was the most comprehensive evaluation. Claire had undergone a detailed review of her history, her previous losses, her current health status, and a panel of laboratory work that went considerably further than any prior testing. Dr. Walsh asked questions with the focused patience of someone who was not satisfied with the surface of things, and Claire answered them with the same quality. At the end of the appointment, Dr. Walsh had said she wanted to run a few additional panels, specialized markers, things that were not part of a standard workup, but that she believed were worth examining, given the particular pattern of Claire's history. Claire had agreed without hesitation. The results would take approximately 2 weeks to process. Dr. Walsh said she would call personally when they were ready. 3 weeks later, on the Thursday morning in mid-November, Claire's phone rang while she was finishing her first cup of coffee. She recognized the number immediately and stepped away from the kitchen, moving to the front hallway, where the sound of Marcus's news program wouldn't carry. She answered on the second ring. His voice when she answered was careful in a way that experienced doctors reserve for conversations they have rehearsed. She had pulled into the parking garage of Massachusetts General before the call ended. Not because she had planned to stop there. She had been driving without a destination, the way people sometimes do when they need their hands to be doing something while their mind works through something too large to hold still. The garage on Fruit Street was simply where the car had stopped, pulled into a dim concrete space, on the third-level engine running heat on low. Dr. Walsh had spoken for approximately 12 minutes. Claire had not interrupted once. She was a surgeon. She understood laboratory panels. She understood the language of results and reference ranges and clinical significance. She did not need the findings translated. What Dr. Walsh described carefully and without sensationalism was a pattern in Claire's most recent blood work that had no business being there. Compounds that did not occur naturally at those concentrations. Markers that suggested something had been introduced into her system over an extended period, not acutely, not in a single instance, but gradually, consistently, in amounts calibrated to remain below the threshold of a standard screening. Dr. Walsh had recommended she come in to discuss next steps. She had also gently, but without ambiguity, recommended that Claire speak with someone she trusted completely before making any decisions about how to proceed. Claire had thanked her. She had ended the call. And then she had sat in that parking space on the third level of a concrete garage and stared at the printed summary Dr. Walsh had sent to a secure portal 2 days earlier, the one she had read once and then closed without fully processing because something in her had not been ready. She was ready now. She opened it again on her phone and read it from the beginning. The findings were exactly as Dr. Walsh had described. Precise, documented, unambiguous. The kind of results that could not be explained by diet, or environment, or coincidence. The kind that required a source. And identifying a source meant tracing access, who had the opportunity, the knowledge, and the proximity to introduce something into her daily routine without her awareness. Claire sat with that question the way she sat with a complex diagnosis, methodically, without rushing toward a conclusion before the evidence supported one. But the evidence did not take long to form a direction. She thought about her mornings, the particular architecture of them, coffee already made, news at low volume, the small amber bottles lined up beside her cup, in the order she took them, set there by the same hands every single day for years. She had never once questioned it. It had been for the entirety of their marriage, a gesture she had filed under care, under consideration, under the category of things a person does when they love someone and want them to feel looked after. She understood now what category it actually belonged to. The clarity was not dramatic. It did not arrive with the emotional weight she might have expected. It came the way certain surgical findings came, with a kind of cold, functional precision that temporarily displaced everything else. Her mind ran the calculation. Access unlimited. Knowledge substantial. A hospital director understood pharmacology far better than the average person. Duration consistent with the timeline of her losses. Motive she did not yet have a confirmed answer to that. But she had enough to know that the question was no longer hypothetical. Outside the garage, she could see the edge of a sky that had gone the flat gray of a Boston winter afternoon. Snow had begun falling at some point during the call, fine and dry, the kind that accumulated quietly without announcing itself. Through the opening in the concrete at the end of the row, she could see it drifting past in long, unhurried lines. She sat there for 20 minutes. She did not make any calls. She did not move from her seat. She simply allowed the information to settle into its proper place in the larger structure of everything. She had been observing for months. The phone never left unattended. The explanations that were always just slightly too smooth. The name mentioned 3 times in a single week, as though it meant nothing, and she watched the shape that emerged when you stopped looking at the pieces separately and allowed them to exist together. It was not a shape she could unknow. There was a moment somewhere in that 20 minutes when she became aware that she was not going to cry. That surprised her faintly. She had expected something, some fracture in the composure she had been maintaining, some release of the pressure that had been building since the third loss, since the second. Since the first quiet morning, she had noticed that something in her marriage did not match its surface. But the tears did not come. What came instead was something quieter and considerably more durable. Resolve. She had spent years absorbing things that should have broken her open, and instead had simply made her more precise. She understood now that precision was what this moment required. Not reaction, not confrontation, precision. She picked up her phone. Rachel Kim had been Claire's closest friend since their first year at Harvard, where Rachel had been pursuing her law degree, while Claire was completing her undergraduate thesis in the biology building across the yard. They had met at a study group that neither of them had found particularly useful, and had spent the following 3 years in each other's company, instead building the kind of friendship that does not require maintenance because it was constructed from something more durable than convenience. Rachel was now one of the most respected family law attorneys in Boston, a woman whose professional reputation rested on her ability to remain clear-eyed in situations designed to produce confusion. She was exactly the right person. The phone rang twice. She did not cry. She had done enough of that. She dialed Rachel's number, and when her friend answered, Claire said only 4 words. "I need your help." Rachel Kim listened, without interrupting. That was the first thing Claire had always valued about her, the quality of her silence. Not the silence of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the silence of someone genuinely processing what they were being given. Rachel had spent 15 years as a family law attorney, navigating some of the most complicated situations a person could find themselves in. And she had learned early that the most useful thing you could offer someone in crisis was not a response. It was space to finish. Claire had told her everything. The mornings, the amber bottles, the 3 losses, Dr. Walsh's call, the parking garage, the 20 minutes of snow falling past a concrete opening while she sat completely still and understood something she could not understand. When she finished, there was a silence of exactly 3 seconds. Then Rachel said, "Don't go home tonight." It was not a question. It was not a suggestion. It was the voice Rachel used when the situation had already moved past the point where gentler language was appropriate. "Come here first," she continued. "We need to talk before you go back to that house." Claire had driven to Rachel's apartment in the South End without argument. By the time she arrived, Rachel had made coffee, cleared the dining table, and pulled out the yellow legal pad she kept for conversations that needed to be thought through on paper before they could be thought through at all. She sat across from Claire and set a pen down. "Tell me again," she said. Slower this time, and so Claire had. Slower, more precisely. The way she would present a case in a clinical setting stripped of emotion, organized by sequence, each piece of information placed in its correct relationship to the others. Rachel listened and wrote and asked clarifying questions that were sharp and specific and revealed exactly how seriously she was already taking what she was hearing. When Claire finished the second time, Rachel looked at her steadily. "You haven't confronted him," Rachel said. "No." "Good, don't." She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward Claire. "I've been tracking some irregular patterns in Hargrove's billing submissions for the past several months," she said. "A client of mine had a claim denied under circumstances that didn't add up. I didn't connect it to Marcus at the time because I had no reason to look in that direction." The numbers on the screen were unremarkable at first glance. Standard insurance, billing codes, denial rates, resubmission records. But Rachel walked her through what she had been observing, and as she did, the pattern emerged the way patterns always did when someone knew how to look. Denial rates on specific claim categories running significantly above the regional average. Processing delays concentrated in particular billing cycles. Documentation requirements that appeared designed to discourage rather than facilitate. "This is preliminary," Rachel said. "But if what you found traces back to the same source, then it's not just personal," Claire said. "No, it's not." They sat with that for a moment. Claire looked at the numbers and thought about the people behind them. Patients who had filed claims in good faith, who had followed every procedure, who had waited for approvals that never came or came far too late. She thought about her father. Raymond Holt was 67 years old and lived in a care facility in Newton. He had been managing a cardiac condition for 2 years, and the procedure his cardiologist had recommended remained on hold because his insurance had declined to cover it. The denial had come through Hargrove's network. Claire had assumed it was bureaucratic delay. She had been meaning to look into it for months. She did not say any of that aloud. Not yet, but she felt the pieces pull toward each other with a quiet, deliberate gravity. Rachel closed her laptop. "If you're going to do this," she said, "you need to do it correctly. No confrontations, no accusations without documentation. Nothing that can be characterized as emotional or impulsive." She paused. "The Hargrove Gala is in 90 days. Every significant decision-maker associated with that hospital will be in one room. If you're going to act, that is the moment." She held Claire's gaze. "But 90 days is not a long time to build something that has to be airtight." "Then we start tonight," Claire said. Rachel nodded once uncapped her pen and wrote the date at the top of the legal pad. They worked until past 2 in the morning. When Claire finally drove home, the streets were empty, and the snow had stopped, and the city had the particular stillness of a place briefly paused between one thing and the next. She let herself into the house on Chestnut Street quietly. Marcus was asleep. She moved through the dark without turning on any lights, navigating by memory through a home she had lived in for 8 years and was only now beginning to understand in full. She climbed the stairs. She changed in the dark. She lay down on her side of the bed with her eyes open and her mind already moving forward, already organizing, already building the first framework of what the next 90 days would require. And then she did something she had never done in 7 years of marriage. She locked the bedroom door from the inside. The next morning, she woke before her alarm. That was not unusual. She had always been an early riser, a habit built through years of pre-dawn rounds and surgical schedules that did not accommodate sleeping in. What was different that morning was the quality of her wakefulness. She was not groggy. She was not gradual. She came awake all at once, completely, the way she did before a procedure she had been thinking about for a long time. She lay still for a moment and listened to the house. Marcus was already downstairs. She could hear the familiar sounds of the morning, assembling themselves below the low pull of a cabinet drawer, the particular note of the coffee maker, completing its cycle, the soft volume of the morning news. Everything exactly as it had always been. She got dressed and went downstairs and accepted the cup he handed her and said the things that mornings required. She was fluent in that language by now. The exchange was brief, unremarkable, and indistinguishable from any other Tuesday in 7 years of marriage. That afternoon, she left the hospital 40 minutes before her last scheduled meeting and drove west on the Pike. The electronics store she chose was in Framingham, 23 minutes from Chestnut Street, far enough to be unremarkable, close enough that the errand would not require explanation if one were ever needed. She paid with cash she had withdrawn the previous week from an ATM 2 blocks from the hospital. She chose a prepaid device, basic functional, the kind designed for practicality rather than preference. She was back in her car within 15 minutes. She activated the device in the parking lot before driving home. That evening, while Marcus attended a dinner he had mentioned 3 days in advance and described in the efficient shorthand he used for events he considered routine, Claire sat at the small desk in her home office with the door closed and began to build the framework of what the next 89 days would require. She was methodical about it. That was not a conscious decision so much as a professional reflex. She had spent her career in an environment where imprecision carried consequences that could not be walked back, and she had developed the habit of structure, the way other people develop the habit of caution, not because she had been taught to, but because she had seen what happened when it was absent. She created a folder system on the prepaid device that mirrored the organizational logic she used in her clinical work. Dates, sources, categories, each piece of information stored in its correct relationship to the others, labeled with enough specificity to be retrieved quickly and enough neutrality to be meaningless to anyone who did not already know what they were looking at. She worked from what Rachel had shown her as a starting point. The insurance billing patterns Rachel had identified were a thread. Claire followed it the way she followed anomalous results in a diagnostic workup, not by pulling hard and fast, but by tracing carefully, allowing each confirmed finding to indicate the direction of the next. She accessed public records through databases available to anyone with a medical professional login. She reviewed claim denial data aggregated at the regional level. and cross-referenced it against Hargrove's reported outcomes. She noted the categories where the numbers diverged most significantly from expected benchmarks. The divergence was not subtle. It was simply buried deep enough in the volume of information that surrounded it to require patience rather than brilliance to find. She found it. The mornings continued as they always had. Marcus set her supplements beside her coffee cup. She took them the same as always, her expression unchanged, her manner unremarkable. She had replaced the contents of the bottles 2 days after her conversation with Rachel, quietly without drama during a lunch break when the house was empty. She had not mentioned this to anyone. She had simply done it and moved forward. She noted the date in her records. She noted everything. The days accumulated. Day 7, day 14, day 22. Each one added something small and specific to the framework she was building. A billing record, a processing timestamp, a pattern in the timing of denials relative to the quarterly reporting cycle. She did not rush. She did not speculate beyond what the documentation supported. She had one rule self-imposed, and absolute nothing entered her records that she could not verify independently. Rachel checked in every few days. Their conversations were brief and deliberately vague. Two friends catching up over the phone, nothing in the phrasing that would stand out to anyone listening casually. Beneath the surface language, they were tracking progress and adjusting the framework as new information arrived. Marcus, for his part, continued to be exactly what he had always been: present, composed, entirely convinced that the world around him was operating according to his design. He mentioned Vanessa twice more in the first 3 weeks, once in the context of a staffing decision, once in passing reference to an administrative meeting. Claire received both mentions with the same neutral acknowledgement she had always offered. She recorded both dates. By the 5th week, she had established a clear picture of the billing irregularities Rachel had first flagged. The pattern was consistent in deliberate claim categories that generated the highest reimbursement rates, showing the steepest denial spikes, concentrated in windows that aligned with periods when external oversight would be at its lowest. It was not the work of carelessness. It was architecture. On the 44th day, she identified a secondary pattern nested within the first. Authorization delays that correlated with a specific subset of patient demographics: older adults, individuals on fixed income plans, people whose likelihood of filing a formal appeal was statistically lower. She documented it without commentary. The documentation spoke for itself. She kept going. On the 61st day, working late in her office, while the house settled into the silence of 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night, she opened a new file, a regional denial registry she had requested access to through a research channel she had used once before for a clinical study. It contained thousands of entries, organized alphabetically, each one representing a person whose coverage request had been declined through one of the networks in Hargrove's administrative umbrella. She had been scrolling for approximately 20 minutes when she stopped. It was on the 61st day, scrolling through a long list of denied claims, that she saw a name she recognized. She went very still. She did not sleep that night, not in the restless circular way of insomnia. She lay still, eyes open in the dark, and simply thought, carefully, completely, following the thread from where it had ended, a name on a screen, a name she had known her entire life, through every implication she could trace from it, and then through the ones she could feel the shape of, but not yet fully see. By 5 in the morning, she had made her decision. Maplewood Care Center sat at the end of a long driveway in Newton, its grounds quiet, under a fresh layer of snow. Claire arrived just after visiting hours opened. She knew the particular smell of the place, clean and institutional, with something warmer underneath the accumulated presence of lives being carefully maintained. She knew her father's room by heart. Raymond Holt was sitting in the chair by the window when she came in. He was 67 years old, with the steady manner of someone who had learned over a long life not to spend words unnecessarily, in the quality of attention that remained, even now, genuinely curious about the world outside his window. A blanket across his knees, a paperback face down on the side table. He was watching the snow fall across the grounds in slow, unhurried diagonals. He looked up when she entered. "You're early," he said. Not an accusation, an observation. She kissed his cheek and pulled the other chair close. They talked briefly about ordinary things, the kind of preamble her father had always understood as necessary. The establishing of two people simply present with each other, before arriving at what actually needed to be said. When she finally asked about the insurance claim, she asked it the way she asked diagnostic questions, directly, but without pressure. "Dad, the procedure your cardiologist recommended, the one that was denied. I've been looking at some records." Raymond Holt's stillness shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. He turned back toward the window. "How long have you known?" Claire asked. The silence that followed was not evasive. It was the silence of a man deciding how much of a burden he was willing to place on someone he had spent a lifetime trying to protect. "Since June," he said finally. 6 months. She had calculated it might be close to that. Hearing it confirmed settled into her chest with a particular weight. "You knew it wasn't a standard denial," she said. "I had someone look at it. A friend with a background in financial documentation." He paused. "He said it had been structured deliberately, in a way that made any formal challenge nearly impossible to sustain." Another pause, longer this time. "It took me a while to understand where it was coming from. But you figured it out." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. Raymond Holt had the eyes of a man who had always seen more than he let on. "I figured out enough," he said. "Enough to know what it would mean for you if I said something." The room was very quiet. Outside, the snow kept falling. "I didn't want you to have to choose between the truth and your marriage," he said. Claire looked at her father, at the careful dignity of a man who had absorbed something painful and chosen silence as protection rather than avoidance. She felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but carried the full weight of both the particular ache of understanding all at once the cost of someone else's love. "He made that choice for me, Dad," she said quietly, "a long time ago." Raymond Holt held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the quiet finality of a man releasing something he had held too long. He reached into the drawer of his bedside table without looking. His hand found what it was looking for immediately, which told her it had been there for some time, waiting for exactly this moment. He withdrew a manila envelope thicker than she had expected and held it out. "I want you to have this, Teets," he said. "I want you to use it." Claire took it from him. It was heavier than it looked. She held it without opening it, feeling the weight of months of quiet effort by a man sitting alone in a care facility, collecting what he could, holding it until the right moment arrived. She did not open it there. She slipped it into her bag and stayed another 30 minutes, letting the conversation return to easier ground, the book, the snow, the small, reliable rhythms of his days. When she finally stood to leave, she held his hand a moment longer than usual. He squeezed her fingers once. She squeezed back. She drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. At her desk door, closed house quiet, she opened it. Inside the envelope were 43 pages. It was more than she had. It was more than enough. It arrived on a Thursday. She found it at 6 in the morning when the cardiac floor of Hargrove Medical Center was still in the particular half-light of an early shift. Change over the overnight staff, finishing their notes, the day team assembling quietly in the hallways, the building not yet running at full volume. Claire had come in early, as she often did in those weeks, finding the hospital's pre-dawn hours useful for the kind of focused work that required fewer interruptions. The envelope was on the floor outside her office door. Plain white, no return address, no printed label. Just her name, written in a clean, deliberate hand. On the front, and below it in the lower left corner, a single letter. V. She stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at it. Then she picked it up, unlocked her office, and closed the door behind her before opening it. The contents were not what she had expected. She had half anticipated something personal. A note, a complaint, the kind of anonymous communication that occasionally found its way to department heads through unofficial channels. What she found instead were documents. Internal documents. 11 pages of billing authorization records from Hargrove's administrative system, printed cleanly and organized in chronological order, spanning a period of 14 months. She set them on her desk and began to read. The material was dense and technical, formatted in the language of institutional healthcare administration, procedure codes, authorization, timestamps, approval chains, override notations. To most people, it would have been impenetrable. To Claire, who had spent the previous several weeks learning to read exactly this kind of documentation, it was immediately legible. And what it said was significant. The records showed a pattern of authorization decisions that deviated systematically from Hargrove's stated protocols, claims routed through specific processing channels at specific times, override approvals entered by a narrow set of administrative credentials, denial determinations made before the standard review window had elapsed. Each individual entry was small. Together, they formed something considerably larger, a structural irregularity embedded so deeply in the ordinary flow of institutional paperwork that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Claire was specifically looking for it. She read through the 11 pages twice. Then she went back to the beginning and read them a third time. This time, with the records she had compiled over the previous weeks open on her laptop, beside the printed sheets cross-referencing entry by entry. The alignment was not approximate. It was precise. Every authorization anomaly in the anonymous documents corresponded to a pattern she had already identified in the publicly available data. The dates matched. The claim categories matched. The administrative override sequences matched. Whoever had compiled these 11 pages had access to the internal system, the layer beneath the publicly accessible data, the layer that contained the actual decision trail rather than the reported outcomes. She sat back in her chair. The first question a careful person asks when they receive unsolicited information is not what it says. It is why it was sent. Anonymous documents could be genuine. They could also be manufactured selectively, edited, or deliberately misleading, designed to direct an investigation toward a predetermined conclusion rather than an accurate one. Claire understood this. She had no intention of incorporating anything into her records that she had not independently verified. She photographed each page with her prepaid device and sent the images to Rachel before her first scheduled procedure of the morning. Rachel called at noon during Claire's lunch break. "Where did you get these?" was the first thing she said. "They were left outside my office," Claire replied. Anonymous. A pause. "I've spent the last 3 hours going through them." Rachel's voice had the particular quality it took on when she was working through something with structural implications, measured, precise, stripped of anything that wasn't directly relevant. The authorization sequences in these documents correspond to records I've been trying to access through formal channels for weeks. These aren't summaries. These are source documents. Whoever put this together had direct system access. "Can you verify them independently?" Claire asked. "I already started. 2 of the override entries can be cross-referenced against public filing records. They match." A brief silence. "Claire, this is the internal layer. If these are authentic, and I believe they are, this isn't someone speculating about what happened. This is someone who was inside the process." Claire looked out her office window at the gray December sky over the Back Bay. The snow had stopped that morning, leaving the city in the particular stillness that follows a storm. Everything muffled, everything slightly suspended. "Keep verifying," she said. "Everything." "Already on it." Rachel paused before ending the call. "Be careful about what conclusions you draw about the source. Whoever sent this and had a reason. That reason may or may not align with yours." Claire had thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, moving through her scheduled procedures, with the focused attention her work required, while the question turned quietly in the background of her mind. She thought about it during the drive home. She thought about it sitting at her desk that evening, entering the day's findings into the records she had been building for more than 2 months. The single letter on the envelope told her almost nothing. It was a beginning, not an answer. It narrowed the field without closing it, which was precisely the kind of information that required patience rather than reaction. She added the 11 pages to her records, flagged as externally sourced and pending full independent verification. She noted the date, the time, the location where the envelope had been found, and the precise condition in which it had arrived. She noted the handwriting as deliberate and controlled. She noted that whoever had left it had done so before 6 in the morning, which required either early access to the building or a familiarity with its security rhythms that went beyond casual knowledge. She noted everything. She concluded nothing prematurely. But that night, lying in the dark of her bedroom with the door locked, as it had been every night for the past several weeks, she found her mind returning not to what the documents contained, but to the question beneath them. Someone inside Hargrove knew what Marcus was doing. Someone had chosen to tell her. The question that kept her awake that night was not who, it was why. The call came on a Sunday evening. Claire was at her desk when her phone rang still, in her work clothes, the remains of a meal she hadn't fully eaten pushed to one side. She had been reviewing files for the better part of 3 hours, cross-referencing the 11 anonymous pages against the broader dataset she had assembled, looking for connections she might have missed in earlier passes. It was the kind of work that rewarded patience over speed, and she had learned by now to give it the time it required. She recognized Rachel's number immediately. What she did not recognize was the quality of Rachel's voice when she answered. In 15 years of friendship, Claire had heard Rachel Kim in almost every register a person's voice could occupy. She had heard her confident and exhausted, focused and frustrated, professionally, composed, and genuinely unsettled. She knew the particular tone Rachel used when something had exceeded the boundaries of what she had expected to find. That was the tone she was using now. Claire, a pause that was slightly too long. I need you to come in, tonight. Not tomorrow morning. Not when you have a chance. Tonight. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Claire said. She arrived to find Rachel's apartment lit up from within every light on the dining table, completely covered in printed documents, her laptop open at one end, with 2 additional browser windows running. Rachel was standing when Claire came in, which was unusual. She typically sat when she worked. Standing meant she had been moving, pacing the physical expression of a mind that had been running hard for several hours and had not yet found a place to stop. She handed Claire a cup of coffee without being asked and gestured toward the table. Sit down, she said. This is going to take a few minutes to explain. Rachel had spent the 4 days since receiving the anonymous documents doing what she did best, following a thread with the methodical persistence of someone who understood that the most significant findings rarely announced themselves directly. She had verified the 11 pages as she had told Claire she would, but in the process of verification, she had found something she had not been looking for. She began with what Claire already knew: the billing irregularities, the denial patterns, the authorization overrides. She presented them not as new information, but as context, the foundation beneath what she was about to show. Then she turned her laptop toward Claire. These are transfer records, Rachel said, from a data licensing agreement filed through one of Hargrove's administrative subsidiaries 18 months ago. She pulled up a second document alongside the first. And this is the receiving entity, a pharmaceutical research firm registered in the Cayman Islands with a primary operational address in Zurich. Claire studied the screen. Patient records, Rachel continued. Not aggregate data, not anonymized statistics. Individual records, diagnostic histories, treatment protocols, medication, responses, demographic profiles. The kind of information that is worth a considerable amount of money to a company developing targeted pharmaceutical products and looking for real-world clinical data to support their pipeline. The room was very quiet. How many records? Claire asked. Rachel looked at her steadily. 417, confirmed in the initial transfer. The agreement includes provisions for ongoing data sharing on a quarterly basis. She paused. These are people who came to Hargrove for care, Claire. They signed consent forms for their treatment. They did not consent to having their personal medical histories sold to a company operating out of the Cayman Islands. Claire looked at the number on the screen. 417. It was specific enough to feel real, in a way that round numbers never quite did. 417 people who had walked through the doors of a hospital they trusted, who had answered questions and submitted to examinations and disclosed the most private details of their physical lives, and who had no knowledge that this information had been transferred across an ocean for profit. She thought about what it meant to be a patient. She thought about the particular vulnerability of it, the way illness required a person to place themselves in the hands of an institution and trust that the institution would honor that placement. She had spent her entire career on the other side of that equation. She had understood it abstractly. Looking at 417 names, she understood it differently. She thought about her father. Raymond Holt had been a patient within Hargrove's network for 2 years. His cardiac records, his diagnostic history, his treatment responses, the detailed documentation of a condition that was at 67. The most significant physical vulnerability of his life had almost certainly passed through the same administrative systems that had generated these transfer records. She did not yet have confirmation that his file was among the 417. She did not need confirmation to understand that the possibility existed. "This is federal," Claire said. It was not a question. "Without question," Rachel replied. "The unauthorized transfer of protected health information across international boundaries triggers multiple layers of federal statute. This is not a civil matter. This is not an internal compliance issue." She sat down across from Claire. "If this is fully documented and substantiated, the individuals responsible are looking at criminal exposure, not professional consequences." Criminal. Claire absorbed that. "Does the documentation support full substantiation?" she asked. "With what we have from your father's envelope, the anonymous pages, and what I've now verified independently, yes." Rachel held her gaze. "We are not speculating. We are not working from inference. We have a documented pattern of conduct across multiple categories of misconduct supported by source materials from 3 independent points of origin." The dining table was covered in paper. Weeks of careful patient work arranged across a flat surface in a South End apartment on a Sunday night, while the city moved quietly outside the windows, and the rest of the world proceeded without any knowledge of what was sitting in this room. Claire looked at it all. She thought about 417 names. She thought about her father's name, and about the procedure he was still waiting for, and about the particular silence of a man sitting by a window in Newton, watching snowfall, holding something painful long past the point when it had stopped being bearable, because he did not want his daughter to have to choose. She thought about what it meant that this had begun for her as something personal, and she understood that it had never actually been only that. This had never been only about her, and that changed everything. 3 days later, she had her answer. Not because she had found it, because it had found her. It was a Wednesday, just past noon, and the 4th floor of Hargrove Medical Center had settled into the particular rhythm of the lunch hour. The pace slightly reduced, the hallways less trafficked, conversations quieter and less purposeful than they would be an hour later when the afternoon schedule resumed. Claire was walking back from the physician's lounge with a coffee. She had not had time to drink at her desk, her mind already organizing the afternoon's caseload when she heard her name spoken from behind her. Not loudly, precisely. She turned. The woman standing approximately 10 feet away was someone Claire had seen before in hallways at nursing stations, in the peripheral awareness that develops naturally in a building where the same people occupy the same spaces day after day. Vanessa Cole was the charge nurse on the cardiac floor, a position she had held for 3 years, and she carried herself with the composed efficiency of someone who understood exactly where she stood in the institutional hierarchy and had long since made peace with the distance between that position and where she intended to be. She was 31, Claire estimated, possibly 32. There was nothing uncertain about her posture or her expression. She stood with the easy stillness of a person who had rehearsed this moment and was not nervous about it. "Dr. Donovan," she said again, "do you have a few minutes?" It was not actually a question. Claire studied her for a moment. Then she glanced in both directions along the hallway. The nearest occupied nursing station was at the far end, 40 feet away. The corridor between them was empty. "Walk with me," Claire said. They moved toward the small alcove near the stairwell entrance at the far end of the floor, a space used primarily for equipment storage, rarely occupied during working hours, with enough ambient noise from the ventilation system to make casual eavesdropping impractical. Claire had not chosen it consciously. She had simply moved toward the most private, available space by reflex, the same reflex that had guided most of her decisions over the past several weeks. She stopped and turned. Vanessa stopped 2 feet away, which was closer than most people would stand, and looked at her directly. "The envelope," Vanessa said. "The one outside your office. That was me." She did not frame it as a confession. She stated it the way a person states a fact. They have decided to make available cleanly, without hedging, as an opening rather than an admission. Claire said nothing. She waited. "I've been aware of what's been happening in the administrative authorization system for approximately 8 months, Vanessa continued. Her voice was low and even calibrated for the space they were in. "I understand how the override sequences work. I understand which credentials are being used and when. I understand the data transfer arrangements with the external research entity." A brief pause. "I understand considerably more than what was in those 11 pages. "Why those 11 pages, specifically?" Claire asked. "Because they were enough to be useful, without being enough to be complete," Vanessa said. "I needed to know whether you were actually looking, or whether you would do what most people do when they receive something they weren't expecting, which is nothing," Vanessa said simply. Claire held her gaze. "And now that you know I was looking," Vanessa's expression did not change. There was no warmth in it, and no particular hostility either. It was the expression of someone engaged in a transaction they had calculated thoroughly and were proceeding with accordingly. "Now we can have an honest conversation," she said. "Then be honest," Claire said. Vanessa looked at her for a moment, not hesitating, simply measuring the distance between where they were and where the conversation needed to go. "I'm not doing this for you, Dr. Donovan," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not doing this because I developed a conscience at a convenient moment, or because I feel some obligation to the patients whose records were transferred, or because I have any particular interest in your situation." She paused. "I'm doing this because when Marcus falls, I intend to be standing." The words landed without drama. That was what made them significant. There was no performance in them, no attempt to soften the calculation they represented. Vanessa Cole was telling her plainly, and without apology, that her assistance was not generosity. It was strategy. Claire absorbed that. She thought about what Rachel had said 4 days ago in the South End, surrounded by documents. Be careful about what conclusions you draw about the source. Whoever sent this had a reason. That reason may or may not align with yours. The reason, it turned out, did not align with hers in any meaningful way. Vanessa was not interested in justice. She was not interested in the 417 people whose private records had been transferred without consent, or in the patients whose claims had been systematically denied, or in anything beyond the specific outcome of Marcus Donovan's removal from a position she had decided she was better suited to occupy. That was the honest answer, and it was, Claire recognized, precisely as useful as it was uncomfortable. The question was not whether Vanessa's motives were admirable. The question was whether the information she possessed was accurate, and whether its accuracy served the purpose of what Claire was building. She thought about her father's file. She thought about 417 names. She thought about the gala, now less than 2 weeks away, and the framework she and Rachel had spent 80 days assembling, and the specific gaps that still remained in the documentation gaps that someone with direct internal system access could fill in a matter of days. Motives, she had learned in surgery, were irrelevant to outcomes. What mattered was whether the instrument in your hand could do the work required of it. The rest was philosophy. She looked at Vanessa Cole for a long moment. She looked at the careful stillness of a woman who had made her calculation and was waiting without apparent anxiety for Claire to make hers. Then she said it. "Send me everything you have." She did not extend her hand. She did not offer anything in return. She did not indicate in any way that what had just occurred between them was anything other than what it was, a functional agreement between two people whose interests happened to point for the moment in the same direction. She didn't trust Vanessa, but she didn't need to. The material from Vanessa arrived over 4 days. 3 envelopes in total, each left outside her office before 6 in the morning, each one more detailed than the last. Claire processed each delivery the same way she had processed the first, methodically verifying every claim against independent sources before incorporating anything into the framework she had been building. Vanessa's internal access was considerably deeper than the initial 11 pages had suggested. Authorization sequences that Claire had identified only in outline were now fully documented. The data transfer records were expanded and annotated. The timeline, which had previously contained gaps, was now nearly continuous. On the 87th day, she sat down at her desk at 9 in the evening and looked at everything she had. It was the most complete body of documentation she had ever assembled. She understood what sufficient evidence looked like the difference between a compelling argument and an irrefutable one. What she had in front of her was the latter. She called Rachel. Rachel arrived 40 minutes later and spent the next hour going through the complete file systematically, page by page, in the focused silence of someone conducting a final review before a consequential decision. When she finished, she closed the last folder and set it on the desk. "It's enough," she said. 2 words. The way Rachel said them, without qualification, without the careful hedging she applied to assessments that contained any remaining uncertainty, told Claire everything. "Structurally, yes," Rachel continued. 3 distinct categories of misconduct, each supported by independent source materials from multiple points of origin. The billing irregularities are fully traceable. The data transfer arrangement is documented from authorization through execution, and the personal matter is supported by laboratory findings from a credentialed, independent physician. She looked at Claire steadily. Any one of these would be significant on its own. Together, they are not a case someone can argue around. Outside the window, the street below was quiet. It had rained earlier, a cold December rain that had not quite become snow. "The gala is in 3 days," Claire said. "Yes." Rachel straightened. "The full board of directors, the major institutional donors, and 3 members of the external audit committee will all be in that room. If the documentation reaches the right people, the institutional response begins before the evening ends. Nothing gets managed quietly." She paused. "I'll coordinate the distribution to the audit committee and senior board members through a separate channel. What you carry in that room is the original, the physical record." They spent the next 30 minutes dividing responsibilities. Rachel would manage the external distribution and had already identified the appropriate regulatory contacts. The timing would be coordinated so that everything moved simultaneously. Nothing staggered, nothing left to chance. Claire would be in the room. When they had covered everything, Rachel closed her notebook and looked across the desk with an expression that went beyond the professional focus that had defined most of their work together. "Are you ready for what happens after?" she asked. Not about logistics, not about timing or documentation. The question beneath all the other questions, the one that acknowledged that what was about to happen could not be undone, and that the life on the other side of it would be organized around entirely different coordinates. Claire thought about the bedroom door, about the sound of the lock engaging on a November night, when she had finally understood what she was dealing with and had made, without ceremony, the first of a long series of deliberate choices. About every morning, she had come downstairs and said the things that mornings required, and returned each evening to a room she had quietly made her own. "I've been ready," she said, "since the night I locked that door." Rachel held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the quiet finality of someone who had needed to ask, and now had the answer she required. She left just past 11. Claire sat alone for a few minutes after the front door closed. Then she gathered the documents, assembled them into a single clean sequence, and placed them inside a plain white envelope. She sealed it. The clock read 11:47. She picked up the navy evening bag she had set out 2 days earlier, chosen because it was the right size, and nothing more, and placed the envelope carefully inside. She pressed the clasp closed, Then she set the bag beside the door and walked upstairs. The envelope was sealed at 11:47 at night, 2 days before the gala. Claire placed it in her evening bag and did not look at it again. The snow had been falling since late afternoon, not heavily. Boston, in early December, rarely committed to a full storm without warning, but steadily enough to coat the sidewalks along Copley Square in a thin, clean layer that caught the light from the street lamps and held it. The city had that particular quality it took on during the first real snow of the season, something between stillness and anticipation, as though the familiar streets had been covered with a version of themselves that was slightly more deliberate than usual. Claire stood at the entrance of the Fairmont Copley Plaza for a moment before going in. She was wearing the navy dress she had chosen 3 weeks ago, not because of how it looked, though it was understated and correct for the occasion, but because of what it did. It was fitted enough to carry no excess, structured enough to require no adjustment, the kind of garment that allowed a person to move through a room without their clothing becoming a consideration. Her evening bag was in her left hand. She did not think about what was inside it. She went in. The lobby of the Fairmont was warm and bright after the cold. Outside, the kind of warmth that came from a building that had been holding a large number of people for several hours. The gala had been in the welcome reception phase for 40 minutes already, and the main ballroom beyond the lobby archway was operating at the particular volume of 200 people who had not yet been called to their tables, a low, layered sound that moved like something fluid, rising and settling, conversation finding its own level. Claire passed through the lobby without stopping. The ballroom was everything Marcus had arranged it to be. He understood the language of these events completely. The chandeliers set at the precise brightness that made every face look its best. The table arrangements designed to suggest intimacy without crowding the floral centerpieces, tall enough to be elegant and low enough not to obstruct the sightlines between seats. It was a room organized to make everyone inside it feel they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Marcus was near the entrance when she came in. He was already in conversation with 2 men Claire recognized as senior members of the hospital's development board. His posture relaxed, his attention distributed between them with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 15 years learning how to be the center of a room without appearing to occupy it deliberately. He was very good at it. He had always been very good at it. He saw her and smiled. It was the particular smile he used at events like this, warm, slightly widened, from his everyday version, calibrated for visibility across a room. He excused himself from the conversation smoothly and crossed toward her, and for a moment, he was simply a tall man in a well-cut dinner jacket, moving through a crowded ballroom toward his wife. And everything about the image was exactly what it appeared to be. "You look beautiful," he said when he reached her. "Thank you," Claire replied. He offered his arm briefly, in the way he did at events, the gesture of a man who understood that these occasions had their own choreography. She accepted it for exactly the length of time the moment required. Then a colleague approached him with a question about the evening's program, and Marcus turned smoothly to answer it, and Claire continued into the room. She moved through the space with the unhurried attention of someone who had thought carefully about this room long before arriving in it. She noted the positions of the round tables relative to the podium at the far end. She noted the placement of the bar, which created a natural gathering point along the left wall. She noted the location of each individual she needed to account for. Vanessa was near the far end of the room, in the vicinity of the cardiac department's assigned table. She was in conversation with 2 other members of the nursing staff. Her posture composed her expression, carrying the controlled neutrality of someone performing normalcy, with full awareness of what the evening actually contained. She did not look toward Claire. She did not need to. Rachel was at a table near the back left corner of the ballroom, partially obscured by a floral arrangement, but with a clear line of sight to the podium and to the majority of the room. She was in conversation with a woman Claire did not recognize, and she did not look up when Claire entered. That, too, was deliberate. They had discussed it. The members of the hospital's board of directors occupied 2 adjacent tables near the center of the room. 7 individuals whose presence had been the organizing logic of Claire's approach to this evening from the beginning. The 3 external audit committee members were distributed among the surrounding tables. She had memorized the seating arrangement from the published chart 3 days ago. She found table 7 without appearing to look for it. It was positioned slightly left of center, with an unobstructed view of the podium and clear sight lines to both the board tables and the room's primary entrance. She had not requested the placement. It had simply been assigned, and when she had seen it on the chart, she had understood that some arrangements required no adjustment.
Sirs. What?
Materialized as she sat down. Something from the bar, he asked. Water, please, she said. Still, he nodded and moved away. Claire set her evening bag on the table beside her. She folded her hands in her lap. Around her, the ballroom continued its pre-dinner movement. Guests finding seats, conversations shifting and reforming, the low orchestral music beneath it all, maintaining the careful impression that this was simply a celebration. An ordinary evening among accomplished people in a beautiful room. She found table 7, she sat down, she ordered water, and she waited for Marcus to look her way. The dinner proceeded the way Marcus liked everything to proceed smoothly, predictably, under control. He moved between tables with the ease of someone who had spent years learning how to be exactly what a room needed him to be. He laughed at the right moments. He nodded at the right names. He touched the right shoulders and said the right things, and the room responded to him the way it always had, with warmth, with deference, with the quiet approval of people who believed they were in the presence of someone worth admiring. Claire watched him from table 7, with the particular focus of someone who already knows what the numbers mean. She did not check the envelope. She did not look at her watch. She ordered a second glass of water and listened to the woman across from her describe a recent vacation to Portugal, and she responded at the right intervals. And she smiled when smiling was appropriate. And she kept Marcus in the corner of her vision the entire time. It was 40 minutes before he returned to his seat. He reached for his water glass. He straightened the napkin across his lap. And then, as his hand moved across the tablecloth, his fingers touched the edge of the envelope. He paused. He looked at it the way a person looks at something that doesn't quite belong, a small confusion, a minor interruption in the pattern of an otherwise flawless evening. The envelope was plain white, unsealed at the top, unremarkable in every visible way. But it had not been there when he sat down for the first course. He was certain of that. He looked at Claire. "What is this?" he asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice he used in board meetings and budget reviews, the voice that had always carried the quiet implication that he was the most prepared person in any given room. Claire looked at him. She smiled. She did not answer. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the envelope. He picked it up, turned it over once with the careful attention he gave to anything he didn't immediately understand, and lifted the flap. He removed the first page. He read it with the same deliberate precision he brought to every document that passed across his desk. Claire had counted on that. She had counted on the fact that Marcus Donovan did not skim. He believed that the person who read most carefully was the person who walked away with the advantage. He had told her that once, early in their marriage, and she had filed it away without knowing yet that she would one day use it against him. She watched his face as he turned to the second page. The change was not dramatic. It never was with Marcus. What shifted was smaller than that, a slight slowing at the eyes, a stillness that replaced his usual composed ease. His jaw did not tighten. His expression did not break. But something behind it went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with calm. It was the quiet of a man who has just understood that the room he is standing in is not the room he thought it was, and who has not yet decided what to do with that understanding. He turned to the third page, then the fourth. Claire reached for her water glass and took a slow sip. Around them, the gala continued the measured current of dinner conversation, the low percussion of glassware and cutlery, the warm hum of 300 people who had no idea what was unfolding at table 7. A board member at the adjacent table made a remark that drew a wave of quiet laughter. A server moved past with practiced silence. The chandelier above the room cast everything in a flattering gold that Marcus had specifically requested when he approved the event budget 6 weeks earlier. He read for 11 minutes. Claire counted every one of them. When he reached the final page, he read it twice. She could tell by the way his eyes paused and returned to the top. When he finished, he placed the last sheet carefully on top of the others, aligned the edges with a small, precise motion, and closed the envelope. He set it on the tablecloth between them. He did not look at her right away. He looked at the envelope, then at the surface of the table, then, at some point in the middle distance, the careful gaze of a man, arranging his thoughts before he spoke. Then he turned to her. "What do you want?" he asked. Claire set her water glass down. "Nothing," she said. "Read it." The two words landed in the space between them, without urgency, without heat. She had practiced them. Not because she needed to. She had known what she was going to say for weeks, but because she had wanted to know exactly how they would feel when the moment came. They felt she found exactly right. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes moved through several things in rapid succession: recognition, calculation, and then something that was not quite either of those. He looked down at the envelope one more time. Then he stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach across the table. He simply placed both hands on the edge of the cloth, pushed his chair back, and rose with the same deliberate composure he brought to every room he had ever entered. He straightened his jacket, right side first, then left. He adjusted both cuffs with 2 short practiced movements. He picked up his water glass, took one slow sip, and returned it to the table. He looked at her once more. Claire did not look away, and then Marcus turned and began walking toward the podium at the front of the room. Claire watched him move straight-backed, unhurried, nodding once to a board member near the edge of the stage. She watched him step past the nearest table without slowing. She watched him reach the low riser where the evening speakers had stood. She watched him straighten the microphone with one careful hand, and Claire understood immediately what he was about to do. He reached the podium with the same unhurried precision he had carried across the room. One hand rested on this edge of the stand. The other adjusted the microphone, a single, practiced motion, the kind that belongs to someone who has stood in front of rooms like this one many times and learned exactly how to make the act of speaking look effortless. He looked out at the crowd for just a moment before he began the way experienced speakers do, letting the room settle into him before he settled into it. Then he smiled. It was a good smile. Claire had always known that about him. It was the kind of smile that made people feel included, warm at the edges, measured at the center, precise in the way that only practiced warmth can be. She had seen it across dinner tables and boardroom chairs and hospital corridors, and she had once believed it meant something. She knew better now. "Good evening," Marcus said. The room responded. A ripple of attention chairs, adjusting glasses set down. He thanked the gala committee by name, 3 of them, each acknowledged with a small, specific detail that made it clear he had prepared, that he always prepared, that he was the kind of man who considered that kind of preparation a form of respect. He spoke about the year the hospital had shared, the expanded cardiac unit, the new residency program, the endowment that had grown by 11%. He moved through the figures with the ease of someone who understood that numbers delivered with confidence feel like evidence of character. Claire sat at table 7 and listened. She kept her hands still in her lap. She kept her expression pleasant and attentive, the expression of a woman at a dinner she has attended many times before listening to a speech she has heard in various forms, in various rooms, across many years, of a life built alongside the man now standing at the front of one. She did not look at Rachel's table. She did not look toward the far side of the room where she knew Vanessa was seated. She kept her eyes on Marcus, and she listened. He was 4 minutes into the speech when his tone shifted. It happened the way Marcus did, most things subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a change in weather that you notice only after it has already arrived. The cadence of his voice slowed by a fraction. His posture, already straight, became something closer to composed. He looked briefly at the tablecloth in front of him, a gesture that to the room read as humility. To Claire, it read as preparation. "Before I close," he said, "I want to say something a little more personal, if you'll allow me." The room allowed him. Rooms always allowed Marcus. "This past year has been one of growth for this institution," he continued. "But it has also been, on a personal level, one of the more challenging years my family has faced. Those of you who know my wife know that she is a remarkable physician, a dedicated surgeon, someone who has given more of herself to this hospital than most people will ever know." Claire felt the shift before she understood it. "What fewer people know," Marcus said, his voice gentling in the way that speakers gentle their voices before they deliver something they want the room to receive as difficult and honest, "is that she has been going through an extraordinarily difficult time. A private struggle, the kind that changes a person in ways that aren't always visible from the outside." He paused. "I say this not to invite speculation, but because I believe in transparency, and because I think when someone we care about is carrying something heavy, the people around them deserve the chance to offer grace rather than judgment." He looked across the room then. His gaze was searching and careful, and it moved slowly, with what the room could only have read as tenderness, toward table 7. "Toward Claire. The difficult time my wife is going through," he said, "is something I hope this community will hold with kindness." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the room did what rooms do when they have been guided carefully. Toward a feeling, it responded. Not with applause, with something quieter than that. A collective turning, a shared and instinctive reorientation of attention toward the subject of what had just been said. 200 pairs of eyes moved to Claire. She felt it before she saw it. The specific weight of a room's attention, arriving all at once, focused and unasked for. The woman across from her stopped mid-sentence. A board member at the adjacent table turned his head with the cautious slowness of someone trying not to be seen looking. Near the far end of the room, she caught the movement of whispered words passing between two people she had known for years. They were not looking at her with cruelty. That was the part Marcus had calculated correctly. They were looking at her with concern, the kind of soft, uncertain concern that is almost worse because it requires no evidence and leaves no room for defense. He had not accused her of anything. He had not raised his voice or made a single claim that could be disputed or disproved. He had simply placed a frame around her in public, in front of everyone who mattered. And the frame said, "This woman is fragile. This woman is not entirely well. Whatever she tells you tonight, hold it gently, because she has been struggling." It was, Claire thought, one of the more precise things he had ever done. She did not look away from him. She did not move her hands from her lap. She did not reach for her water glass, or adjust her posture, or let anything cross her face that the room could read as distress. She simply looked at the man at the podium, the man who had calculated her grief and her loss and every private sorrow of the past 3 years, and quietly arranged them into a weapon, and she waited. 200 pairs of eyes were on her now. Claire did not look away. She did not move. She simply waited the way she had been waiting for 3 months for the moment to arrive on its own. The moment arrived the way Claire had always known it would. Not with noise, not with warning, with the sound of a single chair being pulled back from a table near the far left side of the room. It was a quiet sound, the kind that under any other circumstance would have gone entirely unnoticed in a room of 300 people. But Marcus was still at the podium, and the room was still holding the particular silence of an audience that had not yet decided what to do with what it had just been told. And so the sound of that chair carried. People turned. A woman was standing. She was in her early 30s, composed, dressed in the kind of understated professional attire that belongs to someone who understood that the goal tonight was not to be noticed for the wrong reasons. She stood at her full height and did not look at Claire. She did not look at the board members at the tables closest to the podium. She looked at Marcus. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. It reached the far end of the room without effort. Marcus stopped. The microphone was still in his hand. For a fraction of a second, brief enough that most people in the room likely missed it, something moved behind his eyes. Then the practiced composure returned, and he looked at the woman with the patient attention of someone who has learned to manage interruptions gracefully. "I don't believe we've finished for the evening," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be brief." She turned slightly to address the room rather than the podium, and she introduced herself the way people introduce themselves when they want the introduction itself to carry weight. Her name was Vanessa Cole. She had worked at Hargrove Medical Center for 6 years, the last 3 as charge nurse in the cardiothoracic unit. She said this without apology and without emphasis, in the tone of someone establishing coordinates before a journey. Then she began. She did not use notes. She did not reach for a folder or consult a document on her phone. She spoke from memory, and the precision of what she said made clear that the memory had been carefully, deliberately built over a long period of time. She described a billing structure that had been quietly modified over 22 months. She spoke about the specific categories of claims that had been routed through a secondary review process, a process that existed on paper as a quality control measure and in practice as a mechanism for systematic denial. She named the denial rate. She named the average processing delay. She named the categories of patients most affected: elderly, those on fixed incomes, those without the resources or legal knowledge to appeal. The room had gone very still. She spoke about a data licensing arrangement. She used the phrase carefully, licensing arrangement, the way someone uses language when they want accuracy rather than drama. She described how a segment of anonymized patient records had been transferred to a third-party pharmaceutical company operating through a holding structure registered outside the country. She described the volume of those records. She gave the number, 417. Someone at the table nearest the podium set down a water glass. The sound was very loud. Marcus moved. He stepped away from the podium with a composure that was, Claire thought, genuinely impressive under the circumstances. He raised one hand, the gesture of a man who has handled difficult moments before and knows how to signal that he is handling this one. "I think we should take a short break," he said. His voice was still measured, still the voice of the room. "There are clearly some misunderstandings that—" "There are no misunderstandings," Vanessa said. She did not raise her voice. She did not turn toward him with anger. She simply continued looking at the room, at the board members, at the senior physicians, at the department heads and donors and administrators who had built their professional identities around this institution. And she said it again with the same quiet clarity. "There are no misunderstandings." Marcus tried once more. He used the language of procedure, proper channels, appropriate review context that the room deserves to hear. He looked toward the board members at the front tables with an expression that asked them to recognize him as the person in charge of this situation, the way he had always been recognized as the person in charge. No one moved toward him. 2 board members had turned away from the podium entirely. A senior administrator near the center of the room had already reached into her jacket for her phone. A physician Claire had worked alongside for 4 years was leaning toward the person beside him with an expression that had crossed entirely past surprise and arrived at something harder. Marcus was still speaking, but the room had stopped listening. Vanessa had not sat down. She stood exactly where she had stood when she rose from her chair, and she waited with the particular patience of someone who has said what they came to say and is content to let the room absorb it. There was something in her stillness Claire thought that was neither heroic nor entirely clean. Vanessa had not done this for the 417. She had not done it for the patients in the denied claims. She had done it for reasons that were her own, and she would answer for those reasons in whatever came next. But she had done it, and the room had heard it. Claire became aware of her own breathing, slow, deliberate, the breathing of a surgeon entering the most critical phase of a long procedure. She felt the weight of the evening bag in her lap. She felt the edge of the envelope beneath her fingers. She reached in. Her fingers found the envelope, and she stood up. She did not clear her throat. She did not wait for permission. She simply began to speak. Her voice, when it came, was the voice she used in operating rooms, measured, clear, stripped of everything that was not necessary. It was a voice built for precision, for moments when the information being delivered mattered more than the manner of its delivery, and it carried across the room without effort the way voices do when a room has already gone quiet enough to receive them. "My name is Claire Donovan," she said. "I am a cardiothoracic surgeon at this hospital, and I have been conducting an independent review of Hargrove Medical Center's administrative records for the past 90 days. No one spoke. She began with the billing structure, the same one Vanessa had described, but with the documentation to support it. She named the dates. She named the amounts. She described the secondary review process, not as an abstraction, but as a mechanism walking the room through how it had been designed, how it had been implemented, and how it had been used over a period of 22 months to systematically reduce payout obligations to patients who had neither the resources nor the institutional knowledge to challenge the outcome. She spoke about the denial rates by quarter. She spoke about the appeal suppression. She gave the room numbers it could not dismiss. Then she moved to the second category, the data arrangement that Vanessa had named the transfer of patient records to a pharmaceutical holding company registered outside the country was not. Claire explained a licensing oversight. It had been structured deliberately across 4 separate transactions over 14 months. The records had been selected according to specific diagnostic criteria. The selection had been made internally, and the financial consideration received in exchange had not appeared in any document submitted to the hospital's board of directors. 417 patients, not a number, people. She let that sit in the room for a moment before she continued. The third matter, she said, was personal in nature. She did not use clinical language to describe it because she had decided months ago that if she ever spoke about it in public, she would speak about it plainly. She described 3 losses over 3 years. She described a private medical evaluation that had been recommended after the third. She described the results of that evaluation, the identification of a compound found in the nutritional supplements she had been taking throughout each of those pregnancies, supplements that had been selected and provided to her each morning by the same person, without variation, for the better part of 3 years. She did not name him. She did not need to. She walked to the head table. The chairman of the board, a man in his late 60s, who had led the institution for 11 years and had, until approximately 40 minutes ago, considered this a successful evening, looked up at her as she approached. Claire placed the envelope on the table in front of him. She did not hand it to him. She placed it with both hands flat on the surface, and she held his gaze for a moment. "Everything I've described is in there," she said. "Independently verified, 3 separate sources, 90 days of documentation." He looked at the envelope. He did not reach for it immediately, but his hand moved toward it in the way hands move toward things that have already become inevitable. At that moment, the phones began. Not one, several. A board member at the far end of the head table looked down at the screen in his hand with an expression that shifted rapidly through confusion and into something else. Another reached into her jacket. A department head near the center of the room picked up his phone, read something, and put it face down on the table with a slowness that was more telling than any reaction Claire had seen all evening. Rachel had sent the email, the full documentation, the same contents as the envelope, formatted for digital review, addressed to every member of the hospital's board of directors, its legal counsel, the state licensing body, and 2 senior contacts at the relevant federal oversight authority, had arrived in 312 inboxes. At the same moment, Claire placed the envelope on the table. 2 minutes passed. They felt longer. Then the doors at the far end of the room opened. 2 people entered, a man and a woman, both in dark coats, both moving with the particulars unhurried certainty of people who have been waiting for a specific moment and have now arrived at it. They did not announce themselves. They did not need to. The way a room responds to that kind of entrance makes the announcement unnecessary. People near the doors moved back slightly, not in fear, but in the instinctive way of people who understand that the situation has just changed, in a way that places it outside their authority. They made their way toward the head table. Marcus had not moved from where he stood near the base of the podium. He watched the two figures cross the room. He watched the chairman open the envelope. He watched a board member stand and speak quietly to the woman in the dark coat, who listened and nodded and reached into her jacket for something Claire could not see from where she stood. And then Marcus looked at Claire. It was a long look, steady and unreadable the way his looks had always been, but something had gone out of it. The particular quality that had always made her feel in rooms like this one that he already knew more than she did. That quality was gone. What remained was simply a man looking at a woman across a room that had, in the span of one evening, become entirely hers. He said nothing. For the first time in 7 years of marriage, Marcus Donovan looked at her and had nothing to say. Claire held his gaze for one moment. Then she turned. She lifted her evening bag from the back of her chair. She smoothed the front of her dress with one hand, a small, unhurried motion. She took a breath, the kind she took before the most difficult part of a long procedure, when the work was nearly done and what remained was only the closing. Outside, the snow was still falling. Claire picked up her evening bag, straightened her dress, and walked toward the door. She did not look back. The investigation was formally opened on a Monday morning, 11 days after the gala. The suspension had come first, within 48 hours of the evening at the Fairmont. Then the board vote. Then the formal referral to the federal oversight body. Marcus did not contest it publicly. The documentation had been reviewed by people whose professional obligation was to act on exactly that kind of information, and they had acted. Whatever calculations he made in the days that followed, none of it reversed what had already been set in motion. The federal inquiry expanded in its second week to include the data arrangement, the billing structure, and the financial consideration that had been received and not disclosed. Rachel monitored the details. Claire trusted that. Vanessa Cole was appointed to an interim administrative role within the cardiothoracic unit, a reluctant recognition of the institutional knowledge she had demonstrated that evening. But the appointment came with conditions. The same inquiry that had opened on Marcus extended in a narrower form to the circumstances of how certain information had moved through the hospital over the preceding 8 months. Vanessa had known things she had not reported through appropriate channels. She had held them and used them for her own purposes, and the people now responsible for understanding what had happened inside Hargrove were not prepared to overlook that. Claire had decided after some reflection that not knowing how to feel about Vanessa was an acceptable answer. Vanessa had not done a clean thing. She had done a necessary thing for complicated reasons, and the world had a way of eventually presenting complicated people with the full accounting of their choices. The divorce documents arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Rachel had prepared them with her usual thoroughness, 3 months of careful work, distilled into a clean and comprehensive record. Claire read every page. Then she picked up a pen and signed her name, and it was done. She did not feel sad. She had done her grieving already, in parking lots, in hospital corridors, in early mornings, in a house that had never quite felt like home. 3 weeks after the gala, on a Tuesday morning in January, Claire stood at the scrub sink outside Operating Room 4. She ran water over her hands and thought about nothing except the task in front of her. The patient on the table was her father. Raymond Holt, 67 years old, retired physician, resident of a care facility in Newton. A man who had sat by a window watching snow and held a manila envelope in a bedside drawer for 6 months because he had not wanted his daughter to have to choose between the truth and her marriage. His heart had been failing gradually for 2 years. The procedure he needed had been denied repeatedly, systematically, and the delay had cost him time that could not be recovered. What could be done, she was here to do. She entered the operating room. The team acknowledged her without ceremony, the efficient, practiced acknowledgement of people who have worked together long enough to communicate in the compressed language of shared competence. She took her place. She looked at the monitors. She looked at her father's face still and composed beneath the anesthesia. And she allowed herself one breath that was not entirely clinical. Then she began. The procedure took 4 hours and 19 minutes. Claire did not think about the gala during those hours, or Marcus, or Vanessa, or the documents signed on a Thursday afternoon. She thought about the work, the precise and careful movements required at each stage, the monitors and readings and incremental progress of a procedure, going by every measurable standard exactly as it should. At the 3-hour mark, the rhythm shifted. The hesitant, labored rhythm of a heart that had been working too hard for too long grew steady. It did not happen dramatically. It happened the way most important things happen gradually, and then all at once, and then simply as a fact. A steady, even beat. Consistent, reliable, present. Claire heard it. She did not say anything, but something moved through her quiet and complete that had no clinical name. Her father opened his eyes on a Wednesday morning in a recovery room with pale winter light coming through an east-facing window. Claire was sitting beside his bed. When he opened his eyes, she looked up. He looked at her for a long moment with the specific attentiveness of a person who considers looking at someone they love to be a complete and sufficient act. Then he reached out his hand. She took it. That was all. There was nothing else that needed to be said, and neither of them said it, and the room held the silence, not as an absence, but as a presence of its own. She thought about the woman she had been 3 months ago, sitting in a parking lot in the snow, reading results that changed everything. She had been so afraid. She hadn't known yet that fear, when you refuse to let it move you, becomes something else entirely. She had spent 3 months learning that silence could be a weapon. Standing here, she understood that it could also be a gift. Not every battle announces itself. Not every form of strength looks like strength from the outside. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply to stop reacting and begin quietly and without ceremony to build the thing that needs to be built. Claire had built it, and on the other sides of it, there was a recovery room in January, pale light through an east-facing window, her father's hand in hers, a life that was smaller now, and quieter, and more entirely her own. That was not nothing. That was exactly enough. Have you ever had to stay silent when everything in you wanted to speak? Have you ever had to wait, not because you were weak, but because you were building something they couldn't see yet? Tell me in the comments. And if this story found its way to your heart, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it tonight.